And this is not just about gold. And if the reports circulating across global financial circles are even partially true, what we're witnessing could signal a profound shift in how resource power is understood in the 21st century. Because according to emerging claims that have sent analysts into overdrive, Burkina Faso may be consolidating access to as much as 94 tons of gold reserves under new sovereign control, and the political shockwaves are already being felt far beyond West Africa. At the center of this moment is Ibrahim Traore, a leader whose rise has been defined by one message repeated over and over: sovereignty is not symbolic, it is economic. And what you're about to hear is not just a story about bullion sitting in vaults. It's about leverage, power, and what happens when a nation historically positioned at the edge of global finance suddenly steps into the center of its own resource narrative. Stay with us, because this story forces a bigger question. What changes when a country decides its wealth will serve its future first? What set the stage? Burkina Faso has long been one of Africa's significant gold producers. For decades, international mining interests, fluctuating commodity markets, and external financial structures shaped how that wealth moved, who extracted it, who traded it, and who benefited most from its value chain. Gold left the ground quickly, but the long-term structural transformation many citizens hope for often lagged behind. Now, reports suggest a new doctrine is emerging, one focused on increasing domestic oversight, renegotiating resource frameworks, and ensuring that gold wealth translates into national resilience rather than external dependency. If true, the scale being discussed, 94 tons, is not just symbolic. It represents billions in stored value. And in the language of geopolitics, stored value is strategic oxygen. Why? Because gold is more than a commodity. Gold is financial insurance, replaces modern finance, but because it anchors credibility, and credibility is power. Analysts watching this development say the real shock isn't the metal itself, it's the philosophy behind it. For generations, many developing economies were encouraged to monetize resources quickly, extract, export, repay debt, repeat. It was a cycle optimized for liquidity, not sovereignty. But a reserve-first strategy flips that model. Instead of immediate liquidation, wealth becomes a buffer, a shield against currency volatility, a tool for long-term planning. And that's where international observers start paying very close attention, because if Burkina Faso demonstrates that resource consolidation strengthens domestic stability, it challenges an old assumption that developing nations must always prioritize short-term cash flow over strategic reserves. And assumptions, once challenged, tend to ripple outward. Now zoom out to the global reaction. Financial institutions thrive on predictability. Commodity markets operate on expectations of flow: who supplies, who buys, who holds. When a producing nation signals a shift toward reserve accumulation or tighter oversight, markets don't panic, recalculate. And recalculation changes negotiations. Suddenly, trade partners reassess leverage. Currency analysts reconsider reserve dynamics. Regional governments ask a quiet question: if they can do this, and what does that mean for us? This is how resource stories become geopolitical stories. But the real meaning isn't found in vaults or balance sheets. It's found on the ground. Imagine a mining community that has seen gold extracted for generations, roads worn by trucks carrying wealth outward, jobs that arrive in waves but vanish just as quickly. Now imagine a national policy shift where a greater portion of that value cycles back into infrastructure, education, water systems, or industrial diversification. Gold stops being an export headline and becomes domestic scaffolding. That transformation, if executed transparently and sustainably, can redefine how citizens perceive sovereignty, not as rhetoric, but as something tangible: electric grids, agricultural investment, local manufacturing, long-term planning instead of emergency budgeting. Of course, no strategic shift exists without skepticism. Critics would raise legitimate questions: governance, reserve transparency, fiscal discipline, and the risk of over-centralizing economic narratives. History is full of resource-rich nations that struggle to convert natural wealth into broad prosperity. So the debate isn't whether gold matters, it's whether strategy, Accountability and execution can transform resource control into societal resilience. And that debate is exactly where Burkina Faso now finds itself in the eyes of the world. Because symbolically, gold represents independence. Practically, it represents responsibility. Handled wisely, it stabilizes. Handled poorly, it distorts. The world is watching to see which path emerges. Here's the bigger geopolitical layer. Resource sovereignty movements are gaining momentum globally. Nations increasingly want greater say over how their raw materials are monetized and how that revenue shapes domestic futures, energy, minerals, agriculture. The conversation is shifting from extraction to strategy. Gold simply happens to be the most visible symbol of that shift. And when a country asserts stronger stewardship over its reserves, it sends a message far louder than any press conference. We intend to define our economic future ourselves, because once one nation demonstrates a viable framework for turning resource control into long-term leverage, others begin exploring similar models. Quiet meetings happen, policy papers circulate, regional alliances reassess priorities. That's how economic philosophy evolves, not through declarations, but through examples. So what does this moment represent? Not a gold rush, not a financial revolution overnight, but a signal that the conversation about wealth, sovereignty, and development is entering a new phase, one where nations are increasingly asking, how do we convert what we have into what we need? And perhaps more importantly, how do we ensure that future generations inherit strength instead of dependency? Whether the reported scale proves exact or symbolic, the global reaction tells us something critical. Control over resources still shapes power. And power is shifting, not in explosions, but in policy decisions, reserve strategies, and long-term planning. President Traoré has repeatedly framed sovereignty as a mindset, the idea that a nation's future should not be permanently mortgaged to external expectations. Gold, in this context, becomes less about wealth and more about agency. And agency is the currency every nation ultimately seeks. So here's the question that lingers after the headlines fade. What happens when developing nations begin treating their natural wealth not as immediate revenue, but as strategic foundations? What new economic architecture emerges? And who adapts fastest to a world where sovereignty is increasingly measured in reserves, resilience, and long-term vision? One thing is certain, stories like this are not isolated financial curiosities. They are signals of a broader transformation in how nations think about power itself. And the countries that master that transformation will shape the next chapter of global economics. Because in the end, gold doesn't change the world, but how a nation uses it just might.